Hello, everyone. Welcome back to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyun Park from Amalgam Insights, joined as always by Charlie Araujo. Charlie, how are you today?
I'm doing great. My Mets lost last night, but have had a couple of comeback wins, and it's been a good time to be a Mets fan for a change. So that has been exciting. We went apple picking yesterday because it is, of course, the throes of fall here in New York City, and so we drove an hour out of the city and went apple picking. So it's been a good couple of days. It's been nice. How about
Nice.
you?
I missed the fall. Right now, we are having a massive heat wave actually in the Bay Area. It's been about 95 degrees over here. This is our summertime. September and basically early October is when we finally get summer. So it's been pretty brutal because not all of us have air conditioning because like 9/10 of the year you don't even think about it.
If you're trying to make me feel bad for you, it's not working.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Yeah. The other
All right. Well, we have
335 days of the year, we've got a 70-degree highs and 50-degree lows and, no change.
it's sort of like the way that 335 days of the year on this podcast we're talking about AI, and today is no different. We're back to we had a couple of weeks of some relief, but we're back to the enterprise AI show, I'd say. So
Yes.
we're going to start with some big news that I realized I flubbed last week. Boy, did I flub it, but we'll get to that in a second if you want to tee it up and start the conversation.
Sure. So it was hard to ignore, even though we don't talk about funding that often, every other week or so. This one was too big to ignore. OpenAI raised $6.6 billion with investments from everybody from Microsoft to NViDIA to Fidelity. Abu Dhabi came on board. So you've got states, you've got Thrive Capital, but you did not have Apple join after initially saying that they would. So, a bunch of interesting investors here. And then the amount itself, 6.6 billion, obviously a gigantic amount of money that to go into any company. And now all of a sudden, OpenAI is valued at something like $150 billion, give or take. So obviously this company has come out of nowhere, and apparently as part of this they are actually going to finally become a company as well, which we've talked about this in the past, where it's been very confusing to try to figure out, is OpenAI a nonprofit or is it a for-profit company? And all of this is happening in light of basically the entire executive team seeming to be jumping off ship right now. So a lot of interesting things happening there.
Yeah, my big flub was last week. I threw out that they were raising 650 billion, which the reality is these numbers are so big it might as well have been. Obviously, it was at the time the rumor was 6.5 billion, which
Yes.
was pretty close to where they actually landed. It is a staggering amount. In our prep notes, you sent me a question saying the big question with this is it enough because they are losing $5 billion a year, and I thought that's a great point. It's on the
Mm.
one hand a staggering amount of money, and on the other hand losing a staggering amount of money. Now, on the upside, I will say one of the other things that they announced as part of this is they're on pace to generate 3.6 billion in revenue, which is a very important thing because a lot of these companies, even these big valuations, and even in the AI space, are in fact not generating a lot of revenue. So, while clearly not enough revenue to cover their losses, um, at the very least it's showing they're the real deal. It's a real company. It's a big company. They're driving lots of value in all of that. um, but the question is it in fact sustainable? I believe they also announced another $4 billion in lines of credit, so that gives them a couple of years of runway. But you do have to start questioning, and we're going to talk in a moment, I think, next about Microsoft maybe starting to take some of the hits from some of these investments, and I think it's in this really interesting period. We talked last week about Goldman Sachs having the kind of bull versus bear conversations. And I think this is going to just fuel those conversations about, can you justify this level of investment over this period of time? Will it actually pay off? And I'm bullish overall, but I think from an investment standpoint, I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Yeah. So I feel like the last time something like this really happened in tech, I'm not going to count crypto for now, but I'm going to go back to when Amazon Web Services got started, and we saw them put down losses year after year after year. And a lot of people on the financial sides wondered whether this made any sense at all and why people were throwing money at this company that wasn't making any money for so many years. But honestly, I think that everybody is, and then it happened again with Uber, which eventually turned its way around. So I think at this point on the tech side, people are just kind of bought into the idea that it's going to take 20 or 30 billion dollars in losses to create the market leader in this AI space, whatever it ends up being. And I think that this 6 billion, as big as it sounds, is not going to be enough to get OpenAI to the finish line. So when we're talking about 3, 4, 5 years from now, from the when the actual market leader ends up being established, whoever ends up winning is probably going to have to raise at least one or two more rounds that are about this
Well,
size.
especially, yeah, I think there's two issues here. The first is that it's not just the cost of developing the technology, but part of the reasons those losses are so big is that they are having to drive an insane pace because this is a full out arms race. And
Mm-hmm.
so that I think is part of it. And then the second thing, and this is the Goldman Sachs point of view, or at least the bear on the Goldman Sachs side of it, is that unlike a lot of other technologies where the scale was almost all free, here the scale is actually quite expensive. And
Yes.
so that begs the question is it sustainable in the long run? Will they reach this tipping point where it's not, right? If you talk about Uber, well, most of those losses with Uber, even Amazon, most of those losses were in buying the market, in getting out there and owning so much of it, either through discounting or through just the growth, the
Mm-hmm.
rapid expansion. But eventually the scale tipped in their favor.
Right.
And the big question that I think looms over generative AI specifically is, are you going to see that same tipping point because the cost of inference are in fact so high? The operational costs are so high. It's not just the training and not just the go to market, it's the actual sustaining operational costs are so high that that's the big question mark. And to
Yes.
that end, I mean, that's sort of what we're seeing. Microsoft, and not just Microsoft, any of the publicly held AI type companies are starting to take hits because of that, because they're struggling, right? And so there is a story in the Wall Street Journal that you brought out about the headline is Microsoft's AI story is getting complicated, and it's for this exact reason, right? So unlike
Yes.
OpenAI, right, they're publicly held, and the investors are looking and saying, you're spending gobs of money in capital on all this, and is this going to actually generate the return?
Yeah, the story itself said the AI story is getting complicated, but to me it seemed pretty simple. The story seems to be that Microsoft is spending a heck of a lot more money on capital expenditures, servers and chips and hardware to make AI work. They've gone up in a couple of years from something like 14% of their entire earnings going into CapEx to now 23%. And that is estimated to go up to 28% or so in the next couple of years. Microsoft is definitely buying a ton of hardware. And I think that speaks to how difficult it is to get started in AI and to do primary research and primary work if you really want to get into AI in earnest, if you're building your own products, if you're building your own models, if you really want to be an AI first company in reality, you're going to have to spend a heck of a lot more money on pure hardware. We're seeing it. We just talked about with OpenAI. We're seeing it with Microsoft. If you are NVIDIA Jensen Huang right now, you've got to be pretty happy about seeing this, or maybe even Lisa Su over at AMD. The chip makers who can actually fill in those gaps are sitting pretty right now.
Yeah, and we're clearly seeing it filter down into a lot of the hardware players. But I think it's going to continue to beg this question as to what is sustainable. Because the part that I think is interesting with this is that Microsoft is taking the hit in part because if you remember, part of a huge chunk of their investment with OpenAI is in fact in Azure services
Mhm.
that OpenAI uses to run on. And they're really bearing a lot of the brunt when it comes to the hardware costs. And that's sort of what I'm talking about. The overall expense of this is extremely high. It's extremely intensive, and it's extremely intensive to sustain. And I think that sort of begs the question. And I probably the reason, like I said, I won't go as far as to say I'm bearish. I'm not bearish. I use it every single day, and
Mhm.
there is so much value generated. I mean, I already pay for a couple services. I am 100% sure that every company out there will be investing in some form of, in various forms, multiple forms of AI to power various parts of their environment because it's going to drive significant value. So I'm not bearish overall, but I do think that this may not become a game of brute force, or at least if it is the brute force, there's only a couple of survivors on the brute force level, and that most of that value is going to be generated through sort of other means. And so I think there was a couple of articles that we had this week that sort of bring that point out contentiously, I will say, and I want to start with the one that I find contentious, and
Sure.
that is you pulled out an article from Semaphore
Oh
about
yeah.
America's emerging AI leaders, and I'm only partially contentious. So basically, the if I can steal your thunder on, it, then I'll let you cue it up. Is the article basically says Amazon or AI leaders, Amazon, Walmart, and Wells Fargo, and the implication being, hey, there's all these sort of organizations you wouldn't suspect. It wasn't just the IBMs and Amazons and Googles and Microsofts, although they're all on that list. There was a whole bunch of traditional enterprises that were on this list of the S&P 500's top leaders. But I have issues with the sort of methodology, not necessarily with the outcome of what it signifies. But I'll let you take a run at this before I give you my take.
Yes. So Semaphore had this interesting article titled America's Emerging AI Leaders, Amazon, Walmart, and Wells Fargo, written by Mizzy Clifton. And it basically looked at the S&P 500 companies and it tracked the patents, the employees, and the publications associated with AI for each company. And and there were some things that were surprising and some things that weren't surprising. As you would expect, Amazon was near the top in all of these areas. IBM, which has always been very focused on publications and research, was very high on this list. Alphabet slash Google was very high on this list. No surprises there. But I think it was a little misleading for this article to say that it was surprised that Walmart, the likes of Walmart and Wells Fargo, were there because, as we know, Walmart spends a whole lot of money on technology. They've been chasing Amazon. They really do care about their analytics and data and cloud computing. They are one of the most advanced companies on earth. And Wells Fargo, as a financial services company, financial services companies are always they are basically in the business of turning technology into money. That's their entire job. So I think that was a little misleading, but within that, there's some interesting tidbits around companies that you might not expect to be higher up than others. So, for instance, I was surprised when I looked in here and saw that Capital One had more AI patents than, say, Qualcomm or Salesforce or Oracle. Some companies that I would have thought that from a tech perspective would have been ahead. And it just shows the extent to which some of these companies are really investing in their IP for AI.
Yeah, so my issue with this was, well, I have a bunch of them, but one is that there is no weighting, there is no qualification. So
Mm-hmm.
clearly, any company with a lot of employees, if they've somehow, at least I actually went through the actual study and I couldn't find any reference to how they classified what an AI employee
Mm-hmm.
was. So clearly, any company that with a lot of employees, if they somehow label them as AI employees, that's going to put them high on this list. And as you mentioned, if you happen to be an organization that has a big R&D focus, like IBM, then there's obviously a whole bunch of publications and patents related to that. And what is interesting about that is while we both know that, and we have lots of relationships at IBM and have interacted with them over the years, and I think they're doing some interesting things. We almost never talk about them in the AI context because what IBM is
Mm-hmm.
pretty bad about is actually taking all that research and operationalizing and bringing it to market in any way that's
Mm-hmm.
meaningful. And so I think it's, there's a lot of issues with this. The part that I do think is interesting, though, right? So as far as within the tech bounds, I sort of ignore this, right? I mean, again, only publicly held companies, only US based companies. I mean, there's just all kinds of things, right? OpenAI, because they're not
Mm-hmm.
public, isn't on this list. I mean, there's none of the major AI players that we were talking about as far as in the startup side are on this list because of that. I mean, there's all kinds of issues that I have with that side of it. But what I do think is interesting and what is salient about it is, as you pointed out, there's some traditional enterprises on this list, like Cognizant and Capital One, or even Adobe, which isn't, they're sort of in the middle ground. They're a tech company, but they're not traditionally considered an AI type player like this. Wells Fargo, B of A, Citi, Qualcomm, Ford Motor, United Health, right? And what it really speaks to is something we have talked a lot about. That and most with and there there are some notable exceptions that actually have some published publications, but most of these are driven by frankly they're big companies. And they put a lot of employees on this, right? And that's mostly
Mm-hmm.
what's driven their ranking here. Um, if you're a major enterprise, you have to be playing this game some way somehow. Now, are they developing technology? In most cases, probably not. At least not a lot. Most of those resources are going to be in the how do they apply that technology? How do they actually use the technology from some of the other players on this list and bring it to value in a way that is competitive in nature, and maybe mixing in some homegrown stuff. And that is something that I've said forever when it comes to the traditional enterprise, is that your goal should be to figure out what parts of your tech stack provide competitive value in some way to the organization and focus your energy there and go buy everything else, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to me, what the highlight here is that these are also I don't think it should be lost on you that most of these companies are also leaders in their fields, leaders in the industry, and that's why, right? Because they do a good job of that sort of alignment. And so, on the one hand, while I have all these issues with sort of the way they approach this study, for the sake of coming up with a study, I think it did illuminate something that we should not forget, and that is that kind of balance point that you should be striking.
Yes, skeptically, it also makes me wonder how many of these companies are maybe more focused on AI washing compared to others. Because just on principle, it is hard for me to accept that Oracle would be near the bottom of this list from an AI jobs perspective. Obviously, they do so much with data and predictive analytics and IT operations that requires some level of AI that it's hard for me to think that they would have fewer AI employees than practically call it GM or Ford, which I understand smart cars are important, but that important?
Yeah, exactly,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. And so that's sort of my point. That's sort of what I mean by it. I think that also leads into, let's see, we've got a couple other AI ones that I think as far as bringing in. Which one did I want to talk about? Well, I guess it doesn't matter. We'll pick this one up next because it speaks to where I think the sort of value equation around AI. And this was another article I think you pulled up called Augmented Intelligence. What is it? Yeah, so Augmented Intelligence is the name of the company. I just wanted to validate that is coming to market. I guess they've come out of stealth, bringing what they're calling a mix of symbolic AI and generative AI. And I'm really curious. Well, in fact, I'm really curious to hear your take on this because I read it with interest and then was sort of like, it left me sort of flat. I was sort of disappointed with it, but it does point out something that I do believe in. So I'm curious what your take is before I chime in.
Yes. So the news story itself, I would say, is not super special. They raised $44 million. One of their investors is former IBM and Red Hat executive Jim Whitehurst, who has been a fantastic operator as an executive. So all that's interesting, and their approach at Augmented Intelligence is combining generative AI or neural networks along with symbolic AI, which is just a fancy way of talking about the rules-based automation that we have previously used to talk about AI. If you talked about AI 5 or 10 years ago, you would be talking about basically a complex set of rules, but not necessarily getting to kind of an environmental algorithm the way that we do today with generative AI. So being able to combine these uh, capabilities together is just another step forward in making AI smarter. We're already talking about AI combined with retrieval augmented generation and with other systems to be able to get more fact-based outcomes. And I see this as another piece of the puzzle to bring things together and bringing in some of the older AI capabilities into the modern AI world that haven't been well integrated yet. And so that's an interesting potential capability. It's not that we are reinventing AI as much as starting to bring all the pieces together to a greater extent.
So the part of this that I agree with and that I think does make some sense is that, I talked a little while ago about the fact that that there's only going to be one or two winners in the big foundational models, and that most of the value is going to be generated, with this more targeted applicability. Well, one of the ways that I think that happens is this mixing of technologies. I do not believe that most value is going to get created by simply slapping a generative AI engine on top of something. It's going to be having to mix things together. And fundamentally, what what augmented intelligence is bringing to market is that it's something that is combining two forms of technology to try to deliver what it claims are better results. The reason it left me a little flat is that what they're saying that it generates doesn't seem all that different from what the current generative AI players are already talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, this may be a messaging issue. Maybe they just aren't doing a good enough job of communicating how their approach to the technology is going to provide less hallucination and better grounded results and what have you. But where, the quotes in here just didn't leave me going, oh, wow, that's amazing, right? We've done other reviews of other emerging technologies, mostly still in the research stage, where we're going, wow, if that comes true, then that's phenomenal. And I didn't get that sense here.
Mm-hmm.
But nevertheless, I do think that the idea of figuring out how to mix the best technology for the job and to bring them together to solve specific issues, I think is this right and smart move. I think the issue they're having, particularly as far as augmented intelligence, is that I don't know that they have identified that narrow specific problem they're trying to solve better. They're simply trying to say by mixing symbolic and generative, you get a better result, and I'm just not sure that's true.
Right. They know they want something more accurate. What actually will get us there at the end of the day is still very shaky. And we're looking at a lot of different approaches right now. Of course, sorry to bring this up one more time, but at Dreamforce, Salesforce pushed the need to create agents for every single process that already existed and having better integration into your data schema. And that's going to be approach that you probably see from a lot of platform players as well. So we're going to see all these different approaches for how to integrate modern AI with 20, 30, 40 years of data investment and workflow investment.
Yeah, and it's a definitive problem. I mean, so another article that we have up in the queue is from the Wall Street Journal, and its title is AI Doesn't Know Much About Golf or Farming or Mortgages. And it's basically highlighting something that we've talked about, a ton here, and that is that there are all kinds of issues with being able to take this big model and grounding it to your specific data in an enterprise context that actually makes it not just usable, but something you can actually trust. And simple, they gave a simple example about the PGA Tour, and I don't know if it was their CIO, I'm not following right now, but that
Mm-hmm.
one of their executives talking about how they couldn't ask it a simple question about how many times did Tiger Woods won won a PGA Tour um, game and match, and it was getting the answer wrong because it kept answering the number of majors and didn't understand the nuance
Mm-hmm.
of the language that the PGA Tour isn't the same as a major. And that's like this simple, you would think they would get that right. And so now to
Mm-hmm.
get that into anything where there's any specific terminology gaps or specific nuance of context that's required, and that's the real issue. And so, this particular article goes on to talk about RAG, which we've talked about in the past, of one way of doing that, connecting AI to authoritative data sources, and then eventually fine tuning, which of course means training the model more specifically. And all of that's tough. It's all tough. It's all expensive, and every layer of increased veracity drives increased cost and increased maintenance and all that goes with it. And so it just speaks to the fact that, I mean, while I'm not sure that augmented intelligence is doing something that is going to deliver this, there's a definitive need to figure out how to make this more practical and how to actually make it work.
Right. And I think that particular example probably speaks to a very basic relationship. Probably when you look at a biography of Tiger Woods, it says Tiger Woods plays on the PGA Tour and has won whatever 15 majors or whatever that number was. That is basically how it is always stated. The problem is that is stated more often than the number of tournaments that he's actually won. And that's going to be the type of relationship building issue that we see all over the place, because once we tokenize all of this language, all of this becomes a math problem to the model, where you're just trying to figure out which tokens are associated with which other tokens most often. And I hope that is the correct answer. That is fundamentally how these models are programmed to work. And the sooner we learn to accept that that is simply the foundational starting point for all of this AI, the easier it'll be for us to adjust to that and realize there are certain weights and certain relationships that we are just not going to be able to change within these closed models, because that is just how they are programmed. And we have to adjust and align and fine tune and figure out how to create more more customized versions for ourselves at the end of the day.
Yeah, we have to create context, but I also think that part of what this shows too is that you need to, and this is, I guess, the point I was trying to make earlier, is you need to narrow your focus, right? If I'm a CIO today, I'm not necessarily looking at how do I deliver this broad-based solution that's going to be able to answer every single question perfectly. And, I think that there's use in the right context, particularly, I think what this article points out is when the stakes are low, in doing that, and particularly if it's grounded and can, provide a citation or tell you where the source article is, so you can go read it and have trust in it. But there's another article, this one from CIO.com, talking about how AI is transforming business today. And I've talked about before, I don't always love the CIO articles, but I thought this one was actually good, that it actually talked about some pragmatic aspects. And I'll let you read the article, the listener here, in detail. But to the summary, the big takeaway was that the CIOs that are actually seeing results, that are actually delivering value from AI, are targeting two things. One is they're focusing on specific targeted use cases where they can solve a problem that drives value. And secondly, they're actually looking at how can you start using AI not just to drive efficiency, which is where I think so many people are focused on, right? How do I make this process faster or more efficient? But how can I actually transform the process itself? How can I reimagine the way I work using AI as an enabler that does that? And I thought it was just super, super interesting that was not only the focus, but that we're starting to see some actual use cases come out of that people are doing that.
Yeah, I feel like with AI, it's not that people can't figure out a use case that is potentially valuable. It's whether they can actually get the gains that they have been promised, and how certain they are that they can get to that point. That is the real question. Because if you have to get to something like a 10% improvement in applications, in improving job applications, or a 5% improvement in upskilling employees, you have to figure out how to quantify that number, and you have to take into account the training that is necessary to implement the AI and the actual costs of developing the AI itself, all of that. And I think that the uncertainties that happen at each stage currently make it difficult to quantify the ROI of AI in many cases. And this isn't necessarily the AI problem, even. It is a problem with quantifying the outcome that is supposed to happen, because some of these are vague outcomes that are supposed to lead to a return on investment, but then have to actually be counted at the end of the day with something more than a gut check.
Yeah, well, so I think absolutely the quantifiableness of the outcome you're seeking, and then something else the article points out that we've talked about a lot in the past is that you then need the enabling underpinnings to actually make it work, and that is the data infrastructure, the technologists or the people on your team that can actually put that to use. I think that's why you're seeing some of these companies that we talked about in the earlier article with these huge people assigned to AI. Are they actually creating new AI? Or are they just simply trying to do this, right? And then it's a shift in culture around this vision and being willing to transform the adoption process. And I think that's it's all hard to do. And it speaks to, so if we keep on trucking, another organization I don't like quoting all that often, but Gartner. Oh my gosh, Gartner is actually producing something I want to quote on this show. They have a new report out, a new study that just came out, I guess, a couple of weeks ago now, the top CIO challenges. And as you might expect, the number one challenge is setting an AI strategy. And so that lays into everything we just talked about, that there's so much flux, it's difficult to get your hand around it. But also to the point we just talked about, that so much of your ability to drive success in AI is not about AI, it's about all the stuff that underpins it. The other four things all had nothing to do with AI. It's not directly, right? Data and analytics strategy, security threats, demonstrating IT's value. My God, will we ever get that one straight? And then talent strategy, right? And so I just think it's always important to kind of ground ourselves that if you want to succeed in AI, the place you need to start is in the blocking and tackling, getting your workflows under control, getting your data architecture built out, robust, have data pipelines you can trust, securing your environments, right? And being able to have a communication plan that everyone in the organization understands the value that you are providing. And if you're, and then having the talent to execute on it, right? All of that is the true. If you do all that, then in my opinion, the AI strategy writes itself, right? Because then it becomes very apparent where you're going. But it is still the same stuff that happens over and over and over again. So kudos to Gartner that they actually produced something that, I thought told the truth on this.
Yeah, and so of course, there are issues that we have with some of the research we do, but they do. But when it comes to primary research, when you've surveyed, call it 1,000 IT environment or 10,000 IT executives and managers, it's hard to not get meaningful trends coming out of that. So it's helpful to see that simply that the majority of people are in the situation that you are in, that they are struggling with the soft skills and the data preparation associated with AI. And although I take the stance that AI is not just a data quality problem, it obviously does start with data quality and data management. It's just that AI also has all these other issues around parameterization and modeling and the actual math and the hardware costs that also have to come into play that go beyond the pure data.
Well, I will say one other thing. Part of the reason maybe why I'm a little bit more supportive of this particular research is this wasn't a survey, at least not in the traditional way. So Gartner has a group of they're not analysts, they're what they call executive partners. They're basically consultants. I had a friend that was one of these. He says they're basically like a rent-a-friend for a CIO, that. And so this particular study was effectively then compiling all of the stuff that the executive partners are hearing from the CIOs, from their clients, saying these are the issues, right? So I think this is a really good view into what's really happening out there, and it's something. And maybe this is confirmation bias, but it reinforces certainly what I'm hearing and what I tell people all the time, that these are the real issues that organizations are continuing to face. So take it for what's worth.
Yeah, and I've mentioned this before, that coming from a pure surveying background, that often survey data is 6 months aged by the time it comes out, just because it reflects the historical idea of what people have thought about a technology or a challenge, and inquiry aggregation honestly will give you better real-time data.
Yeah.
So good
So,
for them on that.
So I want to transition to our last two topics, and this last one is an article that I wanted to bring up, despite the fact that I really don't agree with it. But the title is "The End of the SaaS Era: Rethinking Software's Role in Business." It's a Forbes article, and to summarize its basic premise, it's saying that SaaS companies in many cases now are failing to deliver certainly the outside returns that we saw in the early days of SaaS, and that the basic pitch, I guess, is that if you create a piece of software that is truly driving some kind of competitive value for a sector, that rather than selling the software, that what you should do is go acquire or maybe even start a company in that sector and use the software as a source of competitive advantage, because you'll realize far more value in doing that than you can ever get by selling the software and attempting to capture the value through the sale of software. And the reason there's a couple of reasons, I guess, but one of the primary reasons that I sort of disagree with this is that there's really two classes of software. There's the software, as I talked about, that creates competitive value in an organization, but there's a massive amount of software. In fact, most of the companies we talk about provide software that is not, at least in and of itself, providing competitive value or competitive differentiation market. But it is a business you need to run efficiently and can make you more efficient and can contribute to competitive value because you are freeing resources to work on these more strategic activities. But if you look at the ServiceNows, the Salesforces, even the Oracles of the world, almost all of this is not technology that is you don't typically buy from some retailer because they have a better Oracle system versus or better ERP or a better Salesforce management system, right? It is typically because of other factors that may be enabled by technology. And so I look at this, and while this may be true in a very small subset of software technology, most of it, I think this is the wrong way, right? If I'm a company developing all my own software, that just doesn't make any sense. So that was, that's the part I sort of took umbrage with. But it is interesting because I think it speaks to the challenges that the SaaS world is seeing recently with trying to meet these expectations of what this should look like.
Yes, I saw an interesting quote. I can't remember where it came from, but it basically just very short quote. It says was that software can be complete. There are functionalities that can be mature and get to the point where you can put it out once and then you may not have to touch it again for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And for apps like that, they may not fit well into SaaS because you don't have to pay $20 a month and hope that they get updated every year or so because there's nothing left to update. Banks do this all the time with the apps that are on their mainframes that have been running for 50 years to manage basic account information, for instance, because there's nothing else to manage other than having that account number there. That's all there is to it. Or other examples, there are SaaS applications that have very little change, such as something like taxes. There are external changes, but the actual functionality may not change very much. So when you look at those niche applications, sometimes they're good for SaaS, sometimes they're not. And then the flip side, we're starting to see these enterprise apps where you have to wonder whether they want to be SaaS at all. We look at SAP, which has struggled mightily to bring their clients over to HANA simply because they did their R3 update 15 years ago. They made it enterprise wide. They defined all their processes for this R3 platform, and then they realized we never want to touch this again. Much less have it upgraded and then find that things break with new updates. That's sometimes software is complete.
That's an interesting point. As a rule, I don't think I'd agree with that, but I hear you on like the mainframe stuff, and more importantly, it goes back to my fundamental premise is if I have a piece of software running a mainframe that is doing transaction clearing, how much competitive value am I getting from that? Something I absolutely have to do. But my objective there is to manage that down to zero, right? Manage my operating cost of that piece of software as low as I possibly can get.
Yeah.
And in most cases, a SaaS type model is going to work against that, right? So I think that it speaks to it. I think it's the wrong solution to this very real issue that a lot of SaaS players are having, because there's so much pressure right now. I mean, I don't know you could get funding if you came to market with a piece of software that wasn't sold as SaaS today. I think it'd be very, very difficult. And so there's a sort of, I think, challenge with that. What the big takeaway though for me was that regardless of if you're selling a piece of software that is driving competitive differentiation, or if it's something that's more about an operational efficiency kind of play, is that I do think that there is a challenge and a misalignment, because pricing within SaaS companies is almost exclusively driven by the market today instead of any sort of value equation. And so there are definitely a class of software companies that are undervaluing, right? They cannot get the amount of money that is commensurate with the amount of value
Right.
they're actually generating, even if it's not competitive value, right? Even if just because they drive so much efficiency. And so what is interesting is that historically, well, not historically, today, if you're a consulting company, you're going to see significantly less valuation multiples than a software company. And as an analyst, I've advised countless software companies who have a consulting arm. It's like you need to be spinning that off or diminishing that, because you're going to get undervalued if you are seen as a consulting company versus a software company. But when I read this article, the one big takeaway for me is, well, that maybe we may be entering an era where that flips upside down, where now a company comes in and says, I've got a piece of proprietary software. I mix it with professional services and with some consulting, some strategic consulting, to come and help you generate exponential value. And then I'm going to share it to a revenue share on that, right? You're not buying the software. I'm going to come in and I'm going to take a proceed percentage of that. And there's companies that do that. But we may see that actually now is an opportunity for them to generate increased value with this sort of shift. So, it's an interesting, thought-provoking article anyway.
Yeah, it's funny because I cover the IT expense market, and when I look at those expense management companies, the telecom expense management market, which is the oldest and most mature of those, has moved to a point where almost all of the major vendors provide both managed and professional services, because frankly nobody wants to manage their own telephone bills, but when you've got $10 million in telephone and network bills, obviously there's opportunities for optimization. So that has all become managed and professional services. On the flip side, we're seeing cloud FinOps right now, where it's a very hot market. Everybody wants to manage their cloud costs, and you have all these highly skilled engineers who have pushed into these FinOps positions while keeping their cloud engineer salaries. So right now, you're seeing all these super skilled people looking for software tools that need to be updated frequently. So actually a great space for SaaS to be able to skim the top of that market. But it's hard to ignore that over time, that those cloud costs will become like telecom costs 20 years from now, when we really understand how cloud computing works. And we're going to see the same thing. We're going from software tools over to managed and professional services. So to some extent, this seems to be about the maturity of the market and the expertise available to help with those tasks.
Yeah, it is interesting. When we were talking before the show, you mentioned that, and it did. I was sitting here mulling. It's like, could we be seeing the era in which the managed service space finally hits its stride? Because it never really has. I mean, there's a lot of companies use. I mean, there's plenty of companies that are very successful with managed services, but it's really. I mean, we rarely talk about it. It's when you're talking about big tech, you're never talking about managed services. And it does make me wonder if we're, approaching a period where that starts to shift. Talking about shifts, we're going to end our show with, I actually find this to be very sad news. So Microsoft sort of quietly announced the end of their support for HoloLens 2. And the original HoloLens was announced with some fanfare. So what was it, in 2015? So going on 10 years ago, and it was, despite being pretty advanced insofar as it was this wearable technology that was the first truly production, in my opinion, truly production augmented reality sort of thing. Also brought to market with a ton of very targeted enterprise use cases, industrial and others, and it worked. I mean, it was heavy and clunky at times, but it worked. And it, and then with the rise of the metaverse, it sort of seemed that there was this momentum shifting that this was all going to sort of happen. And then I haven't been following it, and maybe this is part of the problem. It sort of lost its luster from a public
Mm-hmm.
standpoint. It seems to have gone away. I find it most ironic, given that just what was it, last week or 2 weeks ago, we talked about Meta introducing, obviously they have their Ray-Ban glasses, and now they have the new, what is it, Orion headset. Apple introduced there, so it's like there seems to be continuing investments with other players, and Microsoft goes away. So sort of sad from my perspective.
Yeah, I still remember getting a killer demo of the HoloLens. I want to say about 8 years ago over at PTC's headquarters, where their CEO, Jim Heppelman, was showing me and some other analysts exactly how you could use the HoloLens as to create this extended reality where you could literally walk through a lab and it would show you step by step how to do lab procedures or how to do manufacturing procedures, exactly where you would take something out of a refrigerator, how long it could last outside of a refrigerator before going bad. All these details that you could easily forget in your day-to-day work. And so it would be helpful to have that kind of assistant. And you could easily see, with a little bit of hardware improvement, how this could have actually been super helpful. And when the HoloLens 2 came out, it was able to track your eyesight to a greater extent, making this even more useful. But it seems like at this point, the HoloLens hardware has been deprecated, as well as steered towards some very specific vertical use cases, such as military use. And I think it's kind of sad to see that the company that really started to make extended reality work is stepping out at a time when the hardware is starting to finally catch up to the vision.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and just so we're clear, they announced that they're going to continue to support it through the end of 2027. So it's not
Mm-hmm.
going away immediately, but clearly it's another transition, another signal of Microsoft. I would argue probably a signal more than anything of Microsoft's continuing shift towards AI and other
Yep.
areas of focus. But it also, I look at this and does, I mean, I think Microsoft has a horrible track record with hardware. This may simply be another sign that they're recognizing that's just not their sweet spot. I'll be really curious because they have hinted at a couple of other things related. So I'll be curious if they, later announce some kind of a partnership deal, if they attempt to apply this on, say, the Apple spatial computing platform, or for that matter, the Meta platform, if they, go back and try to provide a layer of software on other people's hardware. We'll see. But I think it was maybe ahead of its time. I guess we'll see. But a sad thing for me because I always thought it was one of the better products out there that actually delivered some real value.
Yeah, I'm hoping that Microsoft can take some of that research and maybe flip it around and perhaps put it in their Surface tablets, put it into webcams, figure out some smarter way to be able to support uh, the site-based interactions in some way.
Yep, because I'm a believer. It's the future. I think it's where it's going to end up, and but I guess it will be a future without the Hololens.
Yes. Oh, well. And on that sad note, we're going to call this a week. Thank you for joining us. Obviously, we had a lot to talk about across AI, augmented reality, and the future of SaaS. And we'll see what comes up next week. Please please subscribe, please follow, please comment. Please let us know what you thought and what you might want our takes on to be for next week. So until then, see you later.